Picture finding a sealed 2,600-year-old letter buried in the desert, detailing the exact crisis you are facing at work today. It sounds completely impossible, but that is the exact level of staggering precision we are dealing with right now. Tonight's evening news is broadcasting a massive aggressive military alliance forming between Russia and Iran. Politically, this partnership defies every single rule of modern logic. But what if I told you that an exiled man in Babylon watched this exact geopolitical nightmare unfold in high definition millennia ago? These terrifying headlines aren't a surprise. They are the final moves on an ancient chessboard. The trap is about to snap shut. When you first open the book of Ezekiel and flip over to chapter 38, it honestly feels like you are reading the script for a high fantasy movie. You immediately run into these ancient, strange-sounding names like Gog, Magog, and Persia, and your brain just kind of tunes them out. It is incredibly easy to dismiss this entire passage as some sort of confusing, outdated poetic metaphor that doesn't really apply to our modern lives. But here is the thing you absolutely need to understand about biblical prophecy. God does not waste his breath on fairy tales or confusing riddles. What you are actually looking at is a highly precise, deeply accurate geopolitical map. It just happens to use the original names of the neighborhoods before the modern tenants officially moved in. You see, if the prophet had simply written down Russia and Iran 2,600 years ago, nobody back then would have had a clue what he was talking about. Modern political borders are completely temporary, and empires rise and fall, constantly renaming their conquered territories just to suit their own egos. That is exactly why the ancient text relies on the geographical roots and the deep historical bloodlines of the people living in those specific areas. Think of it like someone bulldozing your childhood home and building a brand new apartment complex directly on top of the old foundation. The name on the front door might be completely different now, but the absolute GPS coordinates haven't changed a single inch. So, let's play a little bit of historical detective work and decode the primary leader of this massive coalition, a territory known as Magog. If you look at the writings of ancient historians like Flavius Josephus, he clearly identifies the people of Magog as the fierce, nomadic Scythian tribes. These tribes lived in the vast, freezing and rugged geographical region situated in the extreme north, directly above the Black and Caspian Seas. When you pull up a modern map and draw a straight line directly north from Jerusalem, you hit the massive landmass of modern-day Russia. The text is specifically pointing its prophetic finger at the great, powerful bear sleeping quietly in the frozen north. Now, the second major player mentioned in this ancient military lineup is a lot easier for us to identify without needing a history degree. Ezekiel clearly names Persia as a core partner in this apocalyptic invasion, which is a name that survived beautifully through the centuries. In fact, if you look at a world map from just 100 years ago, you will still see the name Persia printed right there in the Middle East. It wasn't until the year 1935 that the government officially asked the rest of the world to start calling their sovereign nation by its native name, Iran. So there is absolutely zero ambiguity here. The biblical prophet saw the modern Islamic Republic of Iran marching into battle. When you finally take a step back and look at the decoded map, the absolute gravity of this ancient text hits you like a ton of bricks. We aren't just talking about a couple of random, insignificant desert tribes throwing rocks at each other in a localized, forgotten border dispute. We are looking at two of the most heavily armed, technologically advanced, and globally influential military heavyweights on the entire planet right now. The text explicitly places Russia and Iran side by side as the primary architects of a massive, coordinated future assault against the nation of Israel. It is a terrifying realization that the pieces on the board are no longer ancient history. They are tonight's breaking news headlines. But seeing them listed together in this ancient document actually creates a massive, seemingly impossible puzzle for anyone who understands global politics. Historically speaking, these two powerful nations have absolutely no real business being friends, let alone forming a tight-knit, coordinated military alliance. One is rooted in a secular, historically communist worldview, while the other is a strict, radical theocracy driven entirely by intense religious zeal. By all traditional laws of geopolitics, they should naturally oppose each other, constantly clashing over their deeply conflicting ideologies and regional goals. It really forces you to ask, what on earth could possibly happen to force these two complete opposites into the exact same corner of the ring? Let's be completely honest for a second. Seeing Russia and Iran suddenly acting like best friends on the global stage is objectively bizarre. If you look back through the history books, you will quickly realize that these two nations have absolutely no logical reason to team up. For centuries, they have constantly bumped heads over territory, influence, and sheer geopolitical dominance in the Caspian Sea region. It is the kind of political pairing that would make any old-school intelligence analyst spill their morning coffee in pure disbelief. On paper, a deep, trusting alliance between them looks like a completely ridiculous typo in a poorly written spy novel. Yet, here we are, watching this impossible friendship unfold right before our eyes, exactly as the ancient prophet predicted. When you actually break down their core identities, the massive differences between their cultures and governments become glaringly obvious. On one side, you have the massive Russian bear, operating with a mix of secular, post-communist pragmatism and traditional Orthodox roots. On the exact opposite side, you have Iran, functioning as a strict, unyielding Islamic theocracy that dictates every single aspect of daily life. Even economically speaking, they are direct competitors, constantly fighting to sell their massive reserves of oil and natural gas to the exact same global buyers. There is absolutely no shared ideology, no mutual affection, and certainly no deep-rooted cultural bond tying these two powerhouses together. It is a completely unnatural relationship that honestly defies every single rule of traditional foreign policy and international diplomacy. To really wrap your head around what is actually happening here, imagine two ruthless, heavily armed rival mafia bosses who absolutely despise each other. For years, they have been fighting bloody turf wars, stealing from each other and refusing to ever sit in the same room. But one night they both happened to be eating at the same restaurant when the FBI suddenly surrounds the entire building with heavily armed SWAT teams. Instantly, all of their previous hatred goes right out the window because they are suddenly faced with an overwhelming existential threat. They immediately slide into the same booth, start sharing their ammunition, and desperately plan a coordinated escape route together. They certainly haven't magically fallen in love with each other. They are just prioritizing their own survival over their old grudges. That mafia scenario is exactly what we are witnessing on the world stage right now with these two heavily sanctioned nations. The international community, led primarily by Western powers, has basically played the role of the FBI, squeezing them tighter and tighter. Crippling economic sanctions have completely choked their economies, cutting them off from the global financial system and traditional trade routes. They have essentially been backed into a dark geopolitical corner, entirely isolated from the rest of the developed world. Because of this massive external pressure, they realize that they either figure out a way to work together or they completely collapse alone. It is a textbook marriage of convenience, built entirely on mutual desperation and a deeply shared hatred for the Western establishment. If you have been paying attention to the news over the last 3 years, the sheer speed of this forced partnership is honestly staggering. Because they were both locked out of the standard global banking systems, they quietly linked their own financial networks to bypass the US dollar entirely. We are constantly seeing verified reports of massive military exchanges, with Iran shipping thousands of advanced combat drones straight to the Russian front lines. In return, Moscow is actively providing Tehran with unprecedented cyber warfare capabilities, advanced fighter jets, and dangerous nuclear technology assistance. They are aggressively trading weapons, sharing top-secret intelligence, and conducting joint naval drills as if they have been trusted allies for decades. This terrifying level of military integration proves that Ezekiel's 2,600-year-old prophecy wasn't just a lucky guess. It was an exact blueprint. So the massive, impossible military coalition that the ancient texts warned us about is no longer just a theory. It is a heavily armed reality. We literally have the exact players moving into their precise, prophesied positions, completely driven by economic desperation and a shared burning hatred for the West. But let's take a step back and think logically about the massive chaotic invasion they are supposedly going to launch against Israel. Just hating the same enemy and trading a few weapons isn't nearly enough motivation to risk starting World War III in the Middle East. You don't launch a massive, highly risky military campaign unless there is an unbelievable generation-altering prize waiting for you at the finish line. It really makes you wonder what kind of irresistible bait could possibly be dangling right in front of them to trigger the final attack. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Nobody starts a massive global war just because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Waging a military campaign of this absolute magnitude costs an astronomical amount of money, resources, and human lives, so there has to be a massive payoff. In Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 4, God actually gives us the exact, deeply psychological motivation behind this terrifying northern invasion. The ancient text explicitly says that God himself will put hooks into the jaws of this northern commander, physically dragging him out of his comfortable borders. The prophet then clearly states that the entire purpose of this massive military expedition is to take a spoil and to take a prey. In modern terms, this means they are coming to aggressively loot, plunder, and steal a completely game-changing amount of unprecedented wealth. To really understand the sheer power of this prophetic imagery, just picture a massive, incredibly dangerous grizzly bear hibernating in a freezing, dark cave. When the bitter winter hits, that bear has absolutely no desire to leave its warm, safe den and go out into the freezing snow just for fun. But imagine if that massive animal is slowly starving to death, and suddenly the wind shifts, carrying the irresistible scent of fresh, dripping honey from miles away. The bear's basic survival instinct instantly kicks into overdrive, completely overriding its desire to stay comfortable and safe inside the cave. That incredibly strong scent acts exactly like an invisible hook buried deep in its jaw, pulling the massive predator out into the dangerous open. It isn't motivated by anger or politics. It is being driven by an absolute desperate hunger that simply cannot be ignored anymore. Right now, if you look closely at the massive Russian bear, you can clearly see that its economy is bleeding out and growing increasingly desperate. Years of heavy global sanctions and incredibly costly regional conflicts have severely drained their national treasury and crippled their economic infrastructure. They are desperately looking for a massive financial lifeline to sustain their global influence and keep their heavily armed military machine running at full capacity. For decades, their primary geopolitical weapon hasn't actually been nuclear missiles or fighter jets. It has been their absolute dominance over the European energy market. But suddenly, their iron grip on that highly lucrative energy sector is slipping, threatening the very foundation of their national survival. They are essentially a hungry, wounded predator looking for an easy, incredibly wealthy target to violently secure their own financial future. Now let's pivot and look at the tiny, incredibly successful nation of Israel, which historically never had a single drop of valuable oil or gas. For almost a century, people used to joke that Moses led the Israelites for 40 years through the desert just to find the only spot in the Middle East without oil. But over the last 15 years, that old, tired joke has completely vanished, replaced by headlines detailing some of the largest energy discoveries of the 21st century. Israel has uncovered massive, multi-trillion-dollar natural gas fields sitting right off their Mediterranean coastline, known as the Tamar and Leviathan basins. Virtually overnight, this tiny, embattled nation went from being completely dependent on hostile neighbors for energy to becoming a massive, highly lucrative global exporter. They have literally struck liquid gold, accumulating the exact kind of unprecedented, staggering wealth that would make any struggling empire incredibly jealous. This massive economic shift completely changes the geopolitical chessboard, turning Israel into a direct, dangerous competitor to Russia's vital energy monopoly in Europe. Every single cubic meter of gas that Israel sells to the European markets is a dollar taken directly out of the pockets of the Russian war machine. When you combine this incredible new wealth with Israel's booming technology sector, thriving agriculture, and robust economy, the prophetic picture comes sharply into focus. Israel is essentially waving a massive, multi-trillion-dollar piece of fresh meat right in front of a starving, heavily armed, and deeply desperate northern predator. The hook in the jaw isn't some mystical, confusing religious metaphor. It is the brutal, undeniable reality of modern global economics and energy dominance. The irresistible scent of this massive financial prize is exactly what finally pulls the desperate Northern Coalition out of their borders and down into the Middle East. So, you have this incredibly powerful, heavily armed Russian-Iranian alliance, driven by severe economic desperation and lured by unimaginable offshore wealth. The primary pieces are locked into place, completely matching a script written thousands of years before the first oil well was ever drilled. But a massive, history-altering invasion of this scale requires more than just two desperate heavyweights to pull off the ultimate global heist. If you read the rest of the ancient text, Ezekiel starts listing off a fascinating group of secondary nations that eagerly join this terrifying march toward Jerusalem. These aren't just random, insignificant countries. They are very specific, highly strategic players that make this modern geopolitical puzzle even more mind-blowing. It really makes you wonder who else on the modern map is quietly preparing to jump on this dangerous, apocalyptic bandwagon. Once you realize that the heavy hitters like Russia and Iran are permanently locked into their prophetic positions, you really have to look at the rest of the roster. Ezekiel doesn't just stop at the two big bullies on the playground. He actually gives us a surprisingly detailed list of the supporting cast that joins this massive invasion. He rattles off ancient names like Togarmah, Put, and Cush, which sound incredibly exotic and mysterious until you simply map them to our modern borders. When you do that, you are staring directly at the modern nations of Turkey, Libya, and Sudan, forming a very specific, heavily armed geographical ring around Israel. It is frankly astonishing how these specific countries, which have their own chaotic internal problems, are being magnetically drawn into this exact same geopolitical alignment. You would think they have much bigger fish to fry at home, but the prophetic pull seems to completely override all of their domestic common sense. Out of all these secondary allies, the absolute most shocking and heartbreaking shift we have witnessed in our lifetime belongs to modern-day Turkey. If you roll the clock back just 15 or 20 years ago, Turkey was actually one of Israel's strongest, most reliable allies in the entire Middle East. They shared deep military intelligence, conducted massive joint training exercises, and enjoyed a booming, incredibly lucrative tourism and trade relationship that benefited everyone. For a very long time, they were the ultimate shining example of a secular, modernized Muslim nation living in relative peace and cooperation with the Jewish state. Geopolitical analysts honestly thought this ironclad friendship would be the solid anchor of stability for the entire region for decades to come. But then, almost overnight, the political winds shifted drastically, and that strong anchor completely snapped right before our very eyes. It is honestly like watching your two best friends, who have known each other for years, suddenly become bitter, irreconcilable enemies over a span of just a few months. Today, the Turkish leadership has completely abandoned its secular roots, taking a hard, aggressive turn toward radical Islamic nationalism and fiercely anti-Western rhetoric. They have essentially burned the diplomatic bridge with Israel to the ground, openly supporting militant groups and constantly threatening military intervention against their former ally. At the exact same time, they are aggressively cozying up to Russia and Iran, buying Russian missile defense systems and hosting joint diplomatic summits with them. This incredibly dramatic, rapid pivot left Western diplomats absolutely scratching their heads, completely baffled by how quickly a trusted NATO ally could switch teams. But for anyone actually reading Ezekiel 38, this wasn't a shocking plot twist at all. It was just the ancient script finally being fulfilled on live television. Then you look over to the coast of North Africa and see the tragic, chaotic situation unfolding in the modern nation of Libya, historically known as Put. Since the violent overthrow of their government over a decade ago, the country has been completely ripped apart by endless civil war and heavily armed militias. It is essentially a broken, lawless state that has unfortunately become a massive playground for foreign mercenaries, radical extremists, and illegal arms dealers. But guess who quietly stepped into that massive power vacuum to secure a strategic, highly valuable foothold right on the southern edge of the Mediterranean Sea? Moscow has poured a tremendous amount of money, weapons, and private military contractors into Libya, essentially turning it into a proxy state that takes orders directly from the Kremlin. They are positioning their chess pieces right on Europe's doorstep, completely aligning Libya with the Northern Coalition. Right below Egypt, you have the ancient land of Kush, which we know today as the deeply troubled, war-torn nation of Sudan. Much like Libya, Sudan has spent years trapped in a vicious, exhausting cycle of brutal civil wars, extreme poverty, and military coups that have completely destabilized the region. And once again, while the West essentially threw their hands up and walked away from the messy situation, the Russian bear quietly slipped right through the back door. Russia is currently finalizing agreements to build a massive naval base right on the Sudanese coast of the Red Sea, giving them unprecedented control over a major global shipping lane. They are aggressively selling heavy weapons to the military junta and trading military support for highly lucrative gold mining rights to secretly fund their other wars. These aren't just random, accidental alliances. This is a highly calculated, strategic encirclement of the Middle East by a coalition that deeply hates the West. So you have this massive, heavily armed ring of nations, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Libya, and Sudan, all joining forces, sharing weapons and harboring a deep, burning hatred for Israel. The board is completely set, and the sheer military weight of this upcoming coalition is more than enough to make any seasoned geopolitical expert lose sleep at night. You would naturally assume that a tiny nation surrounded by this kind of overwhelming apocalyptic threat would be in a constant state of absolute sheer panic. You would expect their borders to be locked down tighter than Fort Knox, with every single citizen braced for an imminent, catastrophic invasion at any given second. But the ancient text throws an absolute curveball right here, predicting that before this massive army marches south, the target nation will actually be experiencing something completely counterintuitive. It makes you wonder how a nation sitting directly in the crosshairs of the world's most dangerous military alliance could ever possibly let its guard down. When you read the specific conditions required for this massive invasion to kick off, you run into a glaring, almost laughable contradiction. Ezekiel explicitly states that this overwhelming northern coalition will attack a land of unwalled villages, filled with peaceful people living in total unsuspecting security. He specifically emphasizes that they will be resting comfortably, completely exposed, without any massive walls, heavy iron bars, or fortified security gates protecting them. Now, if you have watched even 5 minutes of international news over the last few decades, you know that description sounds absolutely absurd today. Modern Israel is quite literally the most heavily fortified, hyper-vigilant, and technologically defended piece of real estate on the entire face of the planet. They are completely surrounded by massive concrete barriers, sophisticated border fences, and an incredibly dense network of military checkpoints that monitor absolutely everything. Honestly, the idea of them just casually dropping their guard and dismantling their walls right now is like expecting a bank to leave its vault wide open overnight. Their entire national mindset is built around constant high-alert survival, heavily relying on state-of-the-art defense systems like the legendary Iron Dome to swat rockets out of the sky. They have essentially built an impenetrable high-tech fortress to survive in a neighborhood where almost everyone next door explicitly wants them wiped off the map. You don't just survive multiple devastating wars and daily terrorist threats by suddenly deciding to embrace a carefree, vulnerable lifestyle without any borders. So, when the ancient prophet describes a future where this specific nation is lounging around without any walls, it completely breaks our modern understanding of their reality. It forces us to ask, what kind of unimaginable, world-altering event could possibly make the most defensive nation on Earth finally take off its heavy armor? To bridge this massive gap between the ancient text and our current reality, we have to look at the darker side of global diplomacy. Many geopolitical and biblical scholars believe that this incredible vulnerability won't actually come from a military defeat, but rather from a highly deceptive, globally celebrated peace treaty. Imagine a master negotiator stepping onto the world stage, brokering a historic, airtight agreement that finally guarantees absolute security for the entire Middle East. It would be the ultimate political magic trick, convincing a weary, battle-hardened nation that they can finally trust their neighbors and lower their massive defensive shields. If you genuinely believe that the international community and your former enemies have guaranteed your absolute safety, keeping those expensive, ugly concrete walls suddenly seems completely unnecessary. It is a terrifying thought. But historically speaking, the absolute deadliest traps are usually set right in the middle of a warm, comforting embrace. But there is another, incredibly modern angle to this unwalled prophecy that doesn't even require a piece of paper or a fake handshake to fulfill. Think about how completely dependent our modern world, and specifically advanced military defense systems, has become on complex digital networks and constant satellite connectivity. If the highly sophisticated, state-sponsored cyber attack were to suddenly cripple the central grid, those massive, billion-dollar physical walls and automated missile defenses instantly become completely useless. It wouldn't matter how thick your concrete is, or how many iron gates you have locked, if the software running your early warning systems simply goes totally dark. In the blink of an eye, the most technologically fortified nation in human history would suddenly find itself completely exposed, functionally living as an unwalled village overnight. It is the modern equivalent of leaving the front door wide open, not because you wanted to, but because someone secretly hacked the electronic locks from the outside. Whether it is a deceptive political treaty or a catastrophic digital blackout, the result is exactly what the Northern Coalition has been patiently waiting for. They are carefully watching from the shadows, monitoring the situation, and calculating the exact perfect moment when that defensive shield is finally dropped or disabled. You don't charge headfirst into a heavily fortified bunker if you can just wait for the people inside to confidently walk out into the open sunshine. This massive alliance of Russia, Iran, and their proxies isn't just brutal. They are incredibly opportunistic, waiting for that specific illusion of safety to peak. When the target nation finally takes a deep breath, lets its guard down, and mistakenly believes the worst is over, the trap will violently snap shut. It is the ultimate sucker punch, delivered at the exact millisecond the victim feels the absolute most secure and comfortable in their entire history. When this sudden massive invasion finally kicks off, breaching those disabled or dismantled defenses, you would expect the entire world to immediately rush to the rescue. Naturally, your mind immediately goes to the massive Western superpowers, the historic allies who have always promised to fiercely defend that specific region from unprovoked annihilation. You would fully expect aircraft carriers to deploy, fighter jets to scramble, and a massive unified coalition of democratic nations to violently push back against the northern aggressors. But as this horrific, apocalyptic nightmare unfolds on live television, a deafening, terrifying silence actually echoes out from the most powerful capitals in the Western Hemisphere. It honestly defies all modern political logic and completely shatters our understanding of global alliances, leaving us staring at a massive, empty void on the world stage. It really makes you wonder what could possibly paralyze the greatest military forces on Earth while their most crucial ally is being completely surrounded and overrun. When that massive, multi-nation coalition finally breaches those disabled defenses and storms toward the mountains of Israel, you would naturally expect the ultimate geopolitical counterattack. You would assume the United States, along with the entire European Union, would immediately deploy aircraft carriers, scramble fighter jets, and launch a massive unified shock and awe campaign to protect their most vital Middle Eastern ally. It is practically written into the DNA of modern Western foreign policy to fiercely defend that specific, highly contested piece of real estate at all costs. But when you read the ancient text detailing this exact apocalyptic scenario, the response from the West isn't a massive military retaliation. It is just a pathetic, incredibly weak diplomatic memo. Ezekiel 38 describes a group of nations, historically identified as the Western powers, who simply sit on the sidelines and ask the invaders, "Have you come to take plunder?" To really understand who is dropping the ball here, the prophet specifically names Tarshish and all her young lions as the ones sending this useless, strongly worded letter of protest. If you dig into ancient maritime history, Tarshish was a famous seafaring and trading power located in the far west, which most historical scholars directly link to the shores of Western Europe, specifically the British Empire. In classic historical and political heraldry, the mother lion has always been the proud, undeniable symbol of the United Kingdom and its massive globe-spanning colonial reach. Therefore, her young lions are the powerful English-speaking offspring that grew out of that empire. Nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and most importantly, the United States of America. It is a brilliant, highly accurate ancient metaphor for the modern Western alliance, perfectly describing the exact nations we naturally expect to act as the global police force. So here is the million-dollar, incredibly uncomfortable question. Why on earth is the mighty American lion reduced to a helpless, pathetic meow while the Middle East absolutely burns to the ground? You don't just sit back and watch your greatest strategic ally get completely steamrolled by your biggest geopolitical rivals, unless you are physically, economically, or politically incapable of stopping it. This perfectly ties back into exactly what we uncovered in our previous deep dive about the deeply hidden, terrifying prophetic destiny of the United States. We talked about how a massive internal rotting, whether it is a vicious cultural civil war, a completely collapsed economy, or the sudden chaotic disappearance of millions of people, would completely paralyze the nation. The young lion has essentially lost all of its teeth, stripped of its ability to project power across the ocean, and forced to painfully watch the nightmare unfold from a distance. Honestly, it is exactly like being in a neighborhood watch group chat on your phone when you suddenly see on the security cameras that a massive gang is kicking in your neighbor's front door. Instead of actually grabbing a baseball bat, running across the street, and physically stopping the robbery, you just sit on your couch and type, "Wow, are you guys really stealing from them? That is so unacceptable." It is the ultimate cowardly diplomatic cop-out, proving that the era of Western military dominance and global intervention has officially, violently come to a screeching, humiliating halt. The once mighty superpowers are reduced to absolutely nothing more than weak bystanders, completely paralyzed by their own internal bleeding and massive domestic crises. They are way too distracted, fighting for their own survival at home, to even think about sending a single soldier or a single dollar to the Middle East. But here is the truly mind-blowing part that most people completely miss when they get caught up in the terrifying geopolitical panic of this entire situation. This absolute paralysis of the West isn't a tragic accidental failure of foreign policy. It is actually a highly necessary, divinely orchestrated part of the prophetic setup. If the United States and the European Union swooped in with advanced fighter jets and completely obliterated the Russian-Iranian coalition, the history books would just call it another great Western military victory. The world would go right back to violently worshipping human military strength, technology, and the illusion that politicians can actually save us from the apocalypse. God is intentionally removing the Western safety net so that when this massive, impossible army is finally destroyed, nobody on Earth will be able to take the credit for it. By completely taking the American superpower out of the equation and letting this massive, hostile coalition march right up to the very gates of Jerusalem, the stage is set for the ultimate, undeniable showdown. It forces the target nation into a corner where absolutely no earthly ally, no piece of technology, and no diplomatic treaty can possibly save them from utter annihilation. It is the exact, terrifying moment when human history runs entirely out of human solutions, leaving a massive, dark void that simply begs for a miraculous, supernatural intervention. The geopolitical chessboard has been perfectly cleared of all the usual heroes, making sure that the final move belongs to someone else entirely. It really makes you wonder what exactly is going to happen on those mountains when the absolute darkest hour finally arrives. So here is the absolute bottom line. We are no longer just watching the evening news. We are watching a 2,600-year-old prophecy unfold in real time, right in our living rooms. The players are in position, the unthinkable alliances are forged, and the global trap is fully set. But the most important question today isn't what Russia, Iran, or the paralyzed West is going to do next. The real question is, what are you going to do right now? If the ancient scriptures are this chillingly accurate about the exact geopolitical wars of our modern day, what else are they absolutely right about? Are you still anchoring your peace, your family, and your entire future to a fragile, collapsing earthly system? It is time to wake up, step out of the political matrix, and completely re-evaluate where you place your ultimate trust. I want to hear from you. Which of these prophetic nations shocked you the most with their recent actions? And what is the very first step you are taking to spiritually and mentally prepare for what is coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one of them. And listen, if you refuse to be blindly led by the mainstream narrative and want to stay ahead of these unfolding apocalyptic signs, you need to become part of this community right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on all the notifications, and join the hidden channel. The prophetic clock is ticking faster than ever, and you absolutely cannot afford to be caught off guard when the next seal is broken. I will see you in the next video.